Hey there, you are listening to the Moxie podcast, and I'm your host, Jenny Nuccio, global social entrepreneur who loves to do a lot of good in this world, and best known for being the founder and CEO of Imani Collective. This show started with the simple idea of shining light on ordinary people doing courageous things in this world, and over the years has grown to be a hub of not only courageous conversations, but resources, knowledge, and connection. From topics of sustainability to leadership to, of course, a good dose of social entrepreneurship. If you're looking to grow in your knowledge, develop as a leader, and create a ripple effect of impact in this world, then welcome, Changemaker. It is time to ignite your Moxie. Welcome to the Moxie podcast. We are in a new series called Charity Unscripted. This has been a series that I've actually been really excited to just dive deep in with you, because this is something that I think we sometimes get uncomfortable to talk about, both on the founder ED side of nonprofits and as the donor, because it is something that is just constantly looked at or given a lot of criticism on of how we run nonprofits well and where our money is being spent and how we're reporting that, right? There's all these elements that really surround nonprofits and these stigmas that surround charity. And so today, in our first episode of this series, we're going to talk about overhead and overhead misunderstood. And what does that even mean in the nonprofit space? So I want to define overhead, right? I actually pulled up like literal definitions. I don't really need these notes, but I wanted to make sure that we understand what overhead is, right? So overhead is generally defined as a combination of management, general cost, and fundraising expenses, right? We have overhead lands in these three sectors. It lands in management, it lands in general, and it lands in fundraising efforts. And then the program costs, that is part of fundraising, right? So this is separate. We have overhead. Overhead is, again, management, general, and fundraising efforts. So the money that even goes into making fundraising happen, right? That's overhead. And then program costs is the cost incurred in connection to that specific program or activity of an organization. So what tends to happen in nonprofits is when you raise money, you are sharing about a program. So let's give an example of just a water organization. We all know Charity Water is obviously a big one. There's Well Aware. There's a lot of beautiful organizations that work with water. Their main program, their main project is most likely to go into some sort of desolate place and dig a borehole down into the ground, find water, and put a well there. That is the simple version of what they probably do in their main program, their main output. So most likely on the donor side, what are we looking for? We're looking for, okay, my money is going to building that well. And how do I get my money exactly to that village or that city to build my well? I want to know as the donor where my money is and how it's being accounted for. Now, the reality of a nonprofit is there's so many other things that have to come into play, that have to take place for that program to happen. So when we're looking at overhead and when we're looking at donor relations to overhead, there's this big myth and this big misunderstanding of where money should be allocated and spent. The first myth here is that nonprofits are not businesses. Nonprofit is a tax status. Nonprofit, even though their idea end goal is not to make profit and to build a company into multi-million dollars and to sell it, that is not their goal. Their goal is impact. Their goal is the program, but there still has to be profit involved in order for that to circulate back into programs, right? There has to be a savings involved. There has to be a budget that is allocated to all these different activities that happen in the nonprofit. And guess what? The activities that happen in a nonprofit, in philanthropy is not just the program itself. There has to be management of that program. There has to be fundraising efforts of that program. There has to be general expenses like rent, Gmail, like software programs. There are all of these things that have to go into running a nonprofit, just as there is to running a business. The reality, though, here is there's scrutiny on that, right? There's a lot of harshness when we give our dollar, because we want to make sure that the impact is happening. And I think what's happened over the years, especially in the last 2 to 3 decades, is that trust that we once had in the nonprofit sector has turned into mistrust. And a lot of that has to do with media coverage. A lot of that has to do with misunderstanding what a nonprofit is, or where money has to be allocated, or just our perceptions on servant leadership or nonprofit leaders, all of that. And so we're going to break that down a little bit. But I do want to talk about overhead. Because in the next couple episodes, we will talk through, can charity be trusted? We're going to give some case studies on some media coverage and how media then, pulled away donations from organizations and made them suffer or made them shut down, all of that. And I want to remind you guys that Charity Unscripted, this series, is inspired by Uncharitable. And Charitable is a documentary that just came out in September of 2023. It also is based on the book Uncharitable, which is based on the TED Talk by Dan Pallotta of how, again, nonprofit and allocation of profits are misunderstood in this space. So that's the inspiration, and I'm just taking that and running with that and diving deeper in this conversation, because this conversation needs to be had. So myths here is one, right? Nonprofits are not businesses, which they need to be. We need to pay attention to business. We need to pay attention to profits. Another thing is nonprofits are more ethical than businesses, which is not always the case. And that is what we'll get into the next episode of talking about, can we trust charity? Can we trust it? And what are the signs that we need to be looking at? But when we're looking at overhead today, I want to keep in mind that to run a successful nonprofit, to run a successful program, we have to have the right people in place. So there's these myths that come in play that low overhead means strong management, or low overhead means all money is going to programs, or saving money is actually necessary for efficiencies. We'll hear all of these different things. But the reality is, if we don't have the profits, or we don't have the money to actually put the right people in place, then programs are going to be less of quality that we're looking for. Programs are not going to actually be pushed out in the way that we want them to happen. Now, I do believe nonprofits need to be very mindful of where money is being allocated, the percentages of that, because if you have 80% of your profits or 80% of your donations coming in only going to management and 20% going to the output of your programs, I think that's a little bit probably not equated to what needs to be happening within the nonprofit itself and the charity. But there is some argument out there that says, okay, well, if you're paying $200,000, $300,000 for this ED, but they're bringing in millions and millions and millions, and when you look at the large scale of things, there's still $5 to $10 million. I'm giving a very hypothetical situation here, but $5 to $10 million still going to the program itself. Is that bad? That's the argument that's being played out in the nonprofit space. I'll challenge that, because I do believe there should be more programmatic, more expenses going out to program. But we also have to keep in mind that what happens in the nonprofit space is we're not able to hire the right people because we just don't have the funding in place. Because a lot of times too, donors will come in and they'll say, well, I want to restrict my donation to only go to X, Y, and Z. And when you as a donor restrict your donation, that is your right to do that. But when you do restrict your donation, it makes it very hard to have general expenses, to have overhead expenses, to bring in the right people to make that program, that restricted expense that you have, happen. And so what we need to look at as a whole is, how are we seeing that we have the right people in place? Now, there are many case studies that I've seen in many scenarios where there will be someone who's gone, say, a 4-year university. They maybe even have a master's in nonprofit management, specifically maybe in, maybe they're even in a mechanical engineer spot and they want to work within, I keep giving a water well example here, but they want to work within an organization that does that. And they're very much qualified, right? But then they come into the nonprofit space and there's only allocation for an $80,000 salary for that director. The reality is that person is most likely not going to take that job because they can go to a business or corporation and make 5 times more money and then utilize 10% of their salary to just donate back to that organization. This is what we see time and time again. Now, the beauty of that is we have people going into really good jobs, using their skills in corporations, then still being having that do good mentality and mindset and partnering with nonprofits for their financial allocation. But the bad thing in this is that we're not getting the right talent in place in our organizations. A lot of times you'll see organizations that use volunteers, that use interns, that use people right out of college. And although that's great to develop and grow people, you need seniors. You need people that have experience within your space to be able to catapult you forward, right? And so we feel, and I see that nonprofit leaders time and time again are burnt out and they're tired because they don't have the right allocations of funds and they don't have the right support. And they have a very small team to do that. So when we're looking at overhead, we need to understand that it's important. It's important for the organization to not just survive, but to thrive. But it's also important to keep nonprofits accountable for their overhead. I am pro overhead, so I will keep pushing into that. We need the right management, we need the right people. At the same time, I also have the balance of understanding that we need to make sure that we're not exploiting that situation and paying our people so much that actually the impact is not happening on the ground. I want to give you an anonymous situation that I've been a part of or that I've seen. I was a part of an organization that raised a lot of money, and they were working with people all over, and I won't give specifics, but what happened is they also had debt on their books. Now, if you want to talk to anybody about debt, if you want to talk to anybody about taking investment or any of that, I'm your girl too, because I can see both sides here. So they took debt on their nonprofit because they were behind in fundraising. I have personal experience on this. So again, I feel as if I can give a lot of advice. That's all I'm saying. So reach out to me if you need advice. But I felt for them when I heard this, when I was heard this scenario, because it really hurt my heart. So they took debt on their nonprofit because they couldn't raise enough money to run their operations. Now, the reality of the output of their actual impact, their actual programs, was actually quite little, but they had a very heavy stateside staff that they were trying to support. And the donor allocations that were coming into their nonprofit were very much restricted to certain programs around the world. So they took on debt so that they could support the staff. And what happened is there was no strategy in place. There was no end game in place. And within 18 months, they ended up going bankrupt and closing their nonprofit down. And this nonprofit has been around for 40 to 50 years. Now, the sad part of this is this is not an uncommon story. What happened here is the leadership there, one, felt that they couldn't have transparency with potentially their supporters, or felt lack of support from their board. There were no solutions that were in place. There was no strategy or performa or 5-year plan that was in place. They were just trying to work in crisis management. So in crisis management, what do? We find solutions and we find them fast. So they found money and they took debt on, and that caught up to them a year later. And then they had to let go of stateside. They started losing management. They started losing traction or support because they didn't have the right talent and the right people that they had trained up. And they ended up shutting down, affecting thousands of people. Thousands. Their overall budget, probably 10% was actually allocated to the programs that were being outputted out all over the world. And now, because they took on debt, because they didn't have support, those people are suffering. From a sustainability perspective, because I find this really important, there are nonprofits, some of you that might be listening that run a nonprofit, that you do not have diversification of revenue in the sense of maybe a product or a service, that you truly only ask for donations. And that is okay, but we have to consider that we shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket when we're asking for donations, right? We shouldn't just have one grant or one major donor. We really need to learn how to diversify across across the field. If you are a social enterprise and you have different avenues of revenue, then you need to start being creative, continue to be creative, and continue to be innovative, because again, we need to be able to spread out the diversification of profits that are coming in, or of revenue coming into our organization, because over time, one of those will probably leave us, or one of those will probably diminish or become less than it is now. And we need to be prepared for that scenario. I find that most nonprofit leaders work in crisis. That's what causes burnout, because there's not planning in place. So when we're looking at overhead and the misunderstanding of overhead, one, if you are a donor listening to this podcast, I would encourage you to ask questions. Asking questions isn't frustrating. Asking questions brings clarity. It brings clear communication, and it allows the founder, or maybe they're not the founder, it allows the executive director, it allows the director of development, whoever that might be, the comfortability to actually speak truth of what's happening. Now, that phrase alone allows for comfortability to speak truth is what we'll talk about in our next episode about charities. Can we trust it? Because I think this is where the even more misconceptions happen, or more scrutiny happens, especially in media, because EDs or director of developments might not want to talk about all that's happening behind the scenes, because they feel that if they do that, they will lose your support. When the reality is, a donor does not just have to be financial support. A donor can also be service support. They can bring in their expertise. They can bring in connections. They can bring in advocacy. You as a donor, I think we always look at that and we allocate that to finances, but you as a donor are so much more. And right now, if you are connected to a nonprofit, I would say give that director a call, because they're needing to hear from you. They're needing the support. They're needing the love, and they're needing someone to say, it's okay. It's okay. You can be you can trust me. You can be transparent. And so I just encourage you to reach out, because there's a lot happening behind the scenes, and probably charities, nonprofits that you support, that they're not maybe putting that to the forefront. And then what happens is we get surprised, like an organization like I talked about in the scenario, when all of a sudden they shut down and we say, excuse me? How did that happen? And we get completely shocked. And you know what's the sad part of the reality of that is if actually the organization leader or the person, any director actually spoke out and actually felt like they had a safe place to speak out to and to call, or anybody, that their organization would probably still be here today. So the reality of overhead is that it has to be there. We have to have the right talent in place. We have to have the right people in place. And that costs money. And so I encourage you to challenge yourself in that, to understand that, hey, if you're going to give a budget, but you're going to restrict money and you're not going to help with general funding, and again, talking to the donor or talking to the ESG funds or talking to the family foundations, whoever you may be, I want to challenge you in where that support is going. We love tangible things. We love buildings. We love impact in lives. Like, we love that tangible. But in order for that tangible impact to happen, there's people behind the scenes that need support. They're the ones driving that impact. And guess what? If we're not caring for the people that are driving the impact to the people, the beneficiaries we want to serve, they're going to burn out and they're not going to be of service anymore. So we need to break down that a little bit. In the book Uncharitable, and also in the documentary Uncharitable, it talks about the roots of this like Puritan culture. And what that means is it's talking about the roots of kind of that servant leadership, that martyrdom spirit. And that is okay to have that mindset of that heart place of, oh, I want to be in service. But I will consistently remind you about our 5 P's of sustainability and what we talk about in the School of Ethical Impact, how we model this in Amani Collective. If you are not caring for or looking at your profit, right? If that profit fails, it will fail your people. If you fail your people, then your purpose is not going to be there anymore. There's not going to be partnerships, and you're not going to ultimately affect the planet that we're in. And all of that ecosystem is all intertwined. But the reality of that ecosystem and actually putting out the 5 P's and making that happen and seeing that happen in your organization and creating sustainability and this cyclical effect is that it starts with you. you are the center of it as a leader, and if you do not care for yourself, if you do not have sustainability of self, your impact will fail. So my cry to the people who are coming in support of organizations that are questioning overhead is I need you to think of that leader, because they are every day fighting for impact. They're every day trying to listen to the voices unheard and be the advocate for them. And then at the same time, they're having to fight scrutiny from you, not to point fingers and say you directly, but from the stigma that is coming from donor bases and all of that. They have to fight that, and they have to justify where money is being spent. And I'm going to let you know from personal experience, that is tiring. That is so tiring. Because every day we fight for these things and these injustices that we want to see change. And then we have to prove to you why we should get paid to do that. My last thing that I will add, and this was my big aha moment a couple years ago, is my biggest voice in my space when I work with Amani Collective is job creation. I truly believe job creation is the root of transformation. I believe when you can create a job and consistency, that is going to completely change someone's life. Anything else. Then you can add on the other loving, compassionate programs, and you can do a lot of community outreach. But job creation is not just a handout, it's a long-term solution, right? And they're going to be able to make choices for their family for generations to come. So that is my heartbeat. That's what I fight for. And a couple years ago, someone, I think it was my husband actually, looked at me and he said, I love that you fight for ethical jobs, that you fight for better wages, that you fight for people to get benefits that are not just, again, the salary, the paycheck, but are medical, that are retirement, that you challenge people to dream a little bit more. But what about you? When are you going to pay yourself? When are you going to give yourself an ethical paycheck? When are you going to actually care for you? Because every day you're tired and every day you fight for them, but when are you going to start fighting for yourself? We can't have hypocrisy within a system that we're trying to create. If we are going to fight for others, we have to fight for ourselves too. And that all is rooted in overhead. And it's a scary word. And it's a scary thing to be like, hey, I deserve to be paid this. My value and my worth is worth this. Because we get tons of pushback that says, well, why? Well, my money could be used elsewhere to go directly to the program, right? But your money cannot be used towards the program unless you have someone running it. So let us ask questions. Let us be transparent. Let us work better together. And let us keep each other accountable to make sure that even if overhead is being paid for and we're bringing in great people, that we're still utilizing all of our funds to go back and that energy to go back into the impact that we want to see for generations. I am so thrilled that you are here and you're part of this conversation. Harder dialogue is sometimes difficult to put out there, but it's a conversation that we need to continue to have. How can we hire the right people? How can we make our impact long-lasting? And how can we be better together? Thank you so much for being a part of the Moxie podcast community. And as always, Moxie on. I love that you were able to join me today, and I'm grateful for the community at the Moxie podcast that continues to grow. To make this show even better, I would love if you could take some time to leave a review, take a screenshot of this episode, share it on your stories, and don't forget to tag the Moxie podcast. I would love to find a way to connect with you. Until next week, friends, Moxie on.